Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. I'm Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Since this is the first lecture of our symposium, and this is the first edition of the symposium, I would like to say a few words before we begin. As usual, I would like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for the financial support received and for the flexibility they are displaying when it comes to the way we employ the support. This symposium was not planned as a webinar. Back in 2019, when the project was submitted to these agencies, our aim was to do a symposium like the ones we were used to. But of course, due to the pandemic, that became impossible. At first, the event was just postponed, but now here we are. Next, I would like to thank all my colleagues from the three research groups in ancient philosophy, of which I'm a member, namely Pragma, Ousia, and Polyphonia, for the continued support for my work and their encouragement when it comes to organizing these events. Since it is the first event that I have organized all by myself, I'm not sure I would have done it without them. And here I would like to make a special mention of Professors Carolina Araújo, Fernando Santoro, and Guilherme Cecílio, who are my closest partners ever since I began to work here in Rio de Janeiro in UFRJ. Last but not least, I would like to thank Roberto Grasso for agreeing to deliver our first lecture, and Professors Breno Zupolini and Lucas Angiani, who are here with us today to debate Professor Grasso's lecture. Although I met Lucas relatively late in my academic life, when I was doing my postdoctoral research, he was extremely important in shaping my views of Aristotle's work and my current research. And it was through him that I met most of the researchers who have been invited to speak in this first year of the Symposium of Aristotelian Studies, including the two who are here today. Before I'm giving this virtual floor to Roberto, I'd like to add two things. The first is that a certificate will be given to those who have registered by email and are here today. All you have to do is fill out the form that I will post in the chat, and I will send them to you as soon as they're ready. The second is that Breno will be our next speaker on the symposium. You can find the date and title of his lecture on our site, which is spelled out below here in the description of this video. Registration for his lecture will begin tomorrow. Without more delay, then, I welcome Professor Grasso to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Roberto, please.
Thank you, Daniel. I want to thank you for this opportunity, and also want to thank Lucas, Breno, and other people who may have already heard some previous version of my talk, and I promise you that there is something new. I don't know if it's better or worse, but there is something new there. So I thank also everybody who is watching this in YouTube or Facebook, and I think we can just start with my presentation, Daniel. And yeah, my presentation is going to be about this famous chapter of the Anima. It's the chapter 5 in book 2 of the Anima, and it's going to be about spatial alterations that Aristotle is introducing in this chapter. So here are the contents of my talk today. I will first of all introduce what I think is the chapter's main thesis, and it's something pretty uncontroversial. Then I will talk about what I think is the key section of this chapter. It's the central chunk of the chapter, and I will label it the knowledge section. And we'll see available interpretations, and briefly I will talk about some problems that I have with this interpretation, and that both sides have with each other. Then I will propose my view about the knowledge section, and finally draw some conclusions. So let's start with the Anima to 5's main thesis. So the main thesis is something that we can summarize as this: perception is somehow an alteration. Aristotle proposed first formulation of this thesis at the beginning of the chapter, when he says that perception is an alloiosis this is in Greek, and this is variously interpreted and translated as perception is a certain alteration or perception is an alteration kind of. Then we have another formulation at the end of the chapter where Aristotle says that in perception, what is capable of perceiving is assimilated to the actually perceptible object acting on it. And this assimilation is a typical mark of alterations. Then we can say that all that happens in between the beginning and the end is Aristotle trying to introduce a notion of spatial alterations by drawing some distinctions and comparison with what happens in knowledge and learning. So the basic question is, what is the peculiarity of perceptual alterations highlighted in the Anima 2.5? And the answer is in the knowledge section. This is uncontroversial. All commentators with different interpretations think that this is what's going on in the chapter and in the knowledge section in particular. So let's see what happens in this knowledge section. So here I will just read the first part of the knowledge section in Christopher Schill's translation. So we have Aristotle drawing some distinction and saying that, and I quote, in the first case, something is a knower in the way in which we might say that a human knows because humans belong to the class of knowers and to those things which have knowledge. So this is the first meaning of knower. Then, and I quote again, but in the second case, we say directly that the one who has grammatical knowledge knows. These are not in the same way potential knowers. Instead, the first one because his genus and matter are of a certain sort, and the other because he has the potential to contemplate whensoever he wishes, so long as nothing external hinders him. And then the passage goes on, and Aristotle says, yet another sort of knower is the one already contemplating, who is in actuality and strictly knowing this alpha. In the first two cases, then, those knowing in potentiality come to be knowers in actuality, but the first one by being altered through learning with frequent changes from a contrary state, and the other from having arithmetical or grammatical knowledge and not actualizing it to actualizing it in another way. This is what happens in the first part of the knowledge section, and the important bits on which I will spend some time in the next slides is this phrase where Aristotle says, in the first two cases, then those knowing in the potentiality come to be knowers in actuality. But for now, I will just present the standard view about the meaning of the first part of the knowledge section. The standard view is this. Aristotle is distinguishing three senses of knower that I will label key 0, key 1, and key 2. Key 0 is the first potentiality of knowledge. We can understand this if we think about someone knowing no science at all. So it's an ignorant human being. K1 is the stage of first actuality of knowledge, and we can understand what this means by thinking about a sleeping scientist. So we are talking about someone who already has a fully developed skill set about a certain discipline, but is not someone who is not exercising this previously acquired body of knowledge. And then we have K2, the second actuality of knowledge, and this is the stage or the activity of someone who activates and exercises previously acquired knowledge. The basic idea here is that Aristotle is distinguishing these three stages because he wants to draw a distinction between two transitions, the so-called first transition by which We go from K0 to K1, namely from ignorance to the first actuality of knowledge, and the second transition by which people who have acquired the first actuality of knowledge switched on this previously acquired skill and engage in some knowing. So K0, K1, K2, first transition, second transition. This is the content of the first part of the knowledge section according to the standard view. So let's move on and see what happens in the second part of the knowledge section. Again, I'm going to read from Schill's translation. Nor is being affected unqualified. Rather, in one way, it is a kind of destruction by a contrary, and in another way, it is rather a preservation of what is in potentiality, but what is in actuality, and of what is like something in the way potentiality is in relation to actuality. For whenever the one who has knowledge comes to contemplate, he is either not altered, since this is a progression into the same state and into actuality, or he is a different kind of alteration. For this reason, it is inappropriate to say that one who understands is altered whenever he understands, in just the way it is inappropriate to say that the builder is altered whenever he builds. Again, I underlined a small piece of this knowledge section, part 2, and this is a particularly controversial sentence, and in particular is controversial what this, which in Greek is hopper, exactly means. This hopper bridges the previous sentence that is translated by Schills as whenever the one who has knowledge comes to contemplate, so bridges this sentence and the following disjunction between not being an alteration and a different kind of alteration, or at least a different kind of alteration according to this translation. So while it is not clear in this translation, as in any translation who has to make a decision about the Greek, the text is ambiguous and its meaning is debated. So now I'm going to distinguish two interpretations of this sentence underlined in the second part of the knowledge section. So there is a common assumption here, and the common assumption is that the disjunction that follows hopper offers two descriptions of one and the same thing. But according to the first interpretation, interpretation 1, the disjunction is crucial to understand what's going on in the chapter, and specifically to understand what Aristotle wants to say about spatial translations, spatial alterations. In this interpretation, this thing is the transition from K1 to K2, namely the second transition. And this second transition can be described either as not an alteration or as a special kind of alteration. So in this interpretation, the model for spatial alterations are second transitions, and the peculiarity of spatial alteration is the following. Spatial alterations involve no contrariety in the initial and final terms, in this case K1 and K2. This is the first interpretation. Now we are going to see how different this is from the second interpretation. In this interpretation, the first one, this is a key text to understand Anima 2.5. In the second interpretation, the disjunction is irrelevant to understand what spatial alterations are. This thing, hopper, is just K2, namely the activity of knowing itself, and not the transition to that activity. And this, namely the activity of knowing, is not an alteration or a kind different from alteration, which is another possible translation of the Greek, and the Greek is heteron genos alloioseos. In this second interpretation, the model for spatial alterations are first transitions, the peculiarity of second alteration is that special alterations are positive, namely they are natural developments, and the key text is not here, but is in the distinction between types of learning-related alterations, which follows in what I will label as the third part of the knowledge section. So we can see that there is a disagreement here. Commentators on both sides produce good arguments, I think, to disprove each other's interpretation. And I won't go into details here because the talk is not about the drawbacks of available interpretations of this text, but I'll say something which I think is probably the most important thing for each of the two interpretations. And with regard to interpretation 2, I think that there is a major drawback, and that this drawback is that despite a clear parallel between the main thesis of the chapter, which is, we remember it, is about spatial perceptual alterations, and the phrase here, which says that there is a different kind of alteration, in interpretation 2, we have to say that this passage is actually not relevant for the clarification of this main thesis of the chapter. And I think this is a major drawback. It's quite an unnatural reading of the passage. Now, the first interpretation doesn't have this drawback, but has its own major drawback, I think. And this is that the first interpretation is committed to the idea that second transitions are a certain kind of alteration, but Aristotle offers no argument in support of this view. Aristotle never says explicitly that second transitions are a special alterations, and even worse, he repeatedly argues that second transitions are not alterations at all. We are going to see how. So, summarizing what I have to say about available interpretations of the knowledge sections, I believe that none of those interpretations is fully satisfying, and I believe that I have a possibly more promising alternative reading to offer. So let's see what this reading is. Let's give you a different reading of the knowledge section. So I will start again with the first part of the knowledge section, but this time I won't read the whole passage again. I will just stress that the text that I had underlined previously was underlined for a reason, and the reason is that this text contains an interpolation, namely a sentence that is nowhere in the original Greek text. The interpolation was made by David Ross, who used it to make the text as close as possible to the unanimously accepted view that Aristotle must be talking about a distinction between first and second transitions in this passage. Now, a more neutral rendering, and a rendering that doesn't include this interpolation, would be like this. And now I will read the second column. Yet another sort of knower is the one already contemplating, who is in actuality and strictly knowing this A. Both the first two then are in potentiality knowers, but the first one having been altered through learning with frequent changes from a contrary state, and the other from having arithmetical or grammatical knowledge and not actualizing it to actualizing it in another way. Now, in this reading, it becomes clear why Ross thought it would be a good idea to add a line in the manuscripts, to the manuscripts. The reason is this: if Aristotle wanted, as all commentators believe, so if Aristotle wanted to say something about a distinction between first transitions and second transitions, in particular, if Aristotle were talking about first transitions here, first transitions by which an ignorant subject becomes a scientist, so if this were the case, the text as we have it would be absurd. Why? Because Aristotle would say that the ignorant human being, the first one, the first knower, is potentially a scientist, for example, having been altered through learning. So is potentially someone who has knowledge in K1 sense, having been altered through learning. Now, this is absurd because this is like saying that someone can begin being taught only after she has been already taught. This would be like saying that someone is thoughtable only after someone has been already taught. What I think commentators fail to realize is that Aristotle is talking about something different and that the text is not absurd. Aristotle is talking about different ways in which full-blown knowers on the one hand and students on the other hand can access the activity of knowing something like an alpha. So my interpretation of the knowledge section, the first part of the knowledge section, is this. We have on the one hand a certain knower who can access the activity of knowing P, and this happens by switching on the first actuality of knowledge, K1, and this happens in full-blown knowledge of an expert, of a master, of a scientist. But we have another knower who can access the activity of knowing P as well, but in another way. This other knower is a human being whose ignorance has been altered by learning, and this is a modification of the inborn state of ignorance, K0, and this is the limited skill set that characterizes a student or apprentice. So this, I think, is what's going on in the first part of the knowledge section. So I will propose a different translation of the knowledge section that show that this, I think, is clearly what's going on there. I won't read it again, but we can go back to this slide if there are questions about my interpretation of the first part of the knowledge section. So let's move on to the second part of the knowledge section. What happens in the second part once we know that in the first part of the knowledge section we have a distinction between the activation of knowledge of students and the activation of knowledge of accomplished knowers. Aristotle says, again, now the being affected is not unqualified, rather one is a destruction of some sort due to the agency of a contrary. And this is classic ordinary alterations, whereas another is rather a preservation under the agency of what is in actuality, of what is similar in the way in which a potentiality is similar to an actuality. For what possesses knowledge comes about by contemplating, which is either not being altered, since the progression is into itself and into actuality, or a different kind of alteration. For this reason, it is inappropriate to say that what is understanding is altered when it does understand. In just the way it is inappropriate to say that the builder is altered when he does build. Now, what's going on here, in my view, at least? In my view, the assumption made by commentators is wrong. This was the assumption that is that follows Hopper refers to two descriptions of one and the same thing. I propose to replace this assumption with a different assumption, and this is that the disjunction that follows Hopper is a classification of knowledge activations. It's a classification of knowledge activation justified by the previous remark that it is by contemplating that what possesses knowledge comes about. So what is this classification of knowledge activations? The classifications is the following. Some activations are not alterations at all. They are non-transformative activations where knowledge skills one had already achieved are merely switched on. Others, activations of knowledge, are alterations of a different kind. They are transformative activations where knowledge skills are transformed, typically under the action of a teacher. I have some illustrations of the difference. So here we have non-transformative activations of knowledge. K1, namely someone who has letters, or a scientist, but the example of Aristotle is with an alpha, a very simple type of content. So let's use the same one. So someone who has letters, K1, switches on this knowledge and engages in knowing this alpha. At the end of this process, there is no transformation. It was K1, it still is K1. Let's see what happens in the case of transformative alterations. Transformative activations of knowledge, typically helped by a teacher. So we have a teacher who has K1 as the agent. We have a patient who is the student who doesn't know any letter of the Greek alphabet. With the assistance of the teacher, the patient, the student, engages in knowing this sign, this alpha. This causes an alteration in the skill set, a transformation in the skill set of the student. And I represent this alteration as becoming something different from K0. Okay, this is what's going on. The advantage of this reading is that we don't have to say that Aristotle says what it doesn't say, namely that second transitions are a certain alteration. So let's move on to part 3 of the knowledge section. In part 3, we have Aristotle saying, thus, with regard to the one who is thinking and understanding, it is fair not to denominate the activation leading from being in potentiality to actuality by using the word teaching, but by some different one. On the other hand, the one leading, so the activation leading a learner and receiver of knowledge from being in actuality, under the agency of someone able to teach and in actuality, either should not be said to be being affected in the way we have said, or there are two types of alteration, a transition toward the privative conditions and another toward the states, hexes in Greek, and the nature. So what's going on in part 3 of the knowledge section, in my view? I think that here Aristotle is proposing a further distinction, which is a distinction internal to transformative activation of knowledge. This is a distinction of learning-related alterations, and the distinction is as follows. Some transformative activations lead to the states, the hexes, and the nature, and this is the case of complete learning that leads to K1. Others, transformative activations of knowledge, lead to tendentially deprivative conditions, which are, I think, diminutions of ignorance by which we progress to further stages of incomplete learning. I have an illustration here as well. This is the illustration of what's going on when someone is led to the perfection of knowledge. We have K0 that undergoes transformative activation of knowledge until K0 becomes K1. And this is what happens in incomplete learning, namely learning of someone who is just starting Greek and is learning the Greek alphabet and learns what is an alpha. We have the agency of the teacher, K1, affecting the students, the patients, K0, absolute ignorance. The patients engages in knowing this alpha, and there is a little transformation in the skill set, which is not the full transformation by which we become experts of ancient Greek. This is something very minor. It's a transformation by which we acquire the skill of recognizing an alpha. Now, I must say that the illustration for complete learning, so the first one, is a simplification. A better illustration would have depicted the arrow connecting K0 to K1 as a very long series of transformational activations, ending in as many different intermediate stages of incomplete learning. For example, if the skill set we are talking about were knowledge of the Greek alphabet, we would have one transformation activation for each letter, alpha, beta, gamma, and so on. So this is what this simple arrows is representing. But what is important here, I think, is distinguishing the second type of transformational activation of knowledge, which is the activation that leads to diminution of ignorance, namely to tendentially deprivative conditions. Now, why I think this is important? I think it is important because we have to read the Anima 2.5 by bearing in mind an important fact about Aristotle's theory of perception. There are important aspects of Aristotle's theory of perception that we should bear in mind at this point, and these are not unknown aspects of Aristotle's theory of perception, but are aspects that, as far as I know, nobody think are relevant for our understanding of the Anima 2.5. So the aspects are this. The first one is that, according to Aristotle, overwhelming stimulations have detrimental effects on sense organs. When we are affected by very intense and powerful perceptual objects, very intense stimulations, we have either permanent or temporary damages to our sense organs. So the classical example is looking at some very intense light and then having this after image remaining in our eyes for a while and affecting the quality of our vision. Aristotle also has this view that the contrary happens with intellectual cognition. In intellectual cognition, intense stimulation produces positive developments. Finally, we have this third aspect of Aristotle's theory of perception. Aristotle says that when overwhelmed, a sense organ can become like an external object. That is, sense organ can become actually perceptible to itself. This is a causal mechanism that Aristotle exploits to explain a series of perceptual illusions. I have some reference here in case you are curious and you want to check whether what I'm saying is actually what Aristotle is saying. But I believe I'm not saying anything new. Experts and scholars who studied Aristotle's theory of perception know this perfectly well. The difference is that I think that all these aspects of Aristotle's theory of perception are crucial to understand what's going on, and what's going on is exactly that Aristotle is saying that perception is a special alteration ending in potentially deprivative conditions, and what he means is exactly this. Perception is a special alteration, is not an assimilation, but it produces some stimulation that is like a condition of stress that can lead to detrimental effects. Thus, perception is analogous, in my view, to transformative activation by which we progress through stages of incomplete learning. Now, in perception, we should pay attention to this. In perception, the starting point is a full-blown capacity. At birth, we already have all the perceptual abilities we need. It's not like knowledge, where we start from a position of ignorance and we have to go through stages of incomplete learning that represents positive developments of our initial ability. In perception, there is nothing like intermediate states of positive development of our initial ability, cognitive ability, or of our initial ability to perceive. The ability to perceive is already complete. Therefore, the potentially deprivative states are conditions that can only have a detrimental effect in relation to the starting point. So deprivative conditions in perception are potentially detrimental rather than developmental. So I think it is a fact that Aristotle's views about perception include those aspects. As I said, I'm not discovering anything new, yet I seem to be alone thinking that these aspects are relevant, or better, crucial to understand what's going on in part 3 of the knowledge section. So I'm ready to give you my conclusion. My conclusion is that the Anima 2.5's main thesis should be understood in the following way. Perception is an analysis this because in normal circumstances it is a special non-assimilative alteration toward tendentially deprivative, namely detrimental conditions. In exceptional circumstances, namely when we are subject to overwhelming stimulations, perception is an actually detrimental assimilation of the patients to the agents. And we should be aware of the fact that, in my view, the Anima 2.5's final admission of perceptual assimilations only refers to what happens in those exceptional circumstances, namely in situation in which the sense organ becomes actually perceptible. It becomes like an actually perceptible object acting on it. Therefore, it becomes actually perceptible to itself. I had no space and time to present another part of my view about Anima 2.5. I will just mention it. I think that this offers Aristotle's final reply to a puzzle he has raised at the beginning of the Anima 2.5, which was a puzzle about why we don't perceive our own sense organs, even though they are perceptible, and even though Aristotle has already said that perception is an analysis test. The expectation would be that every time we perceive, sense organs should become, as it happens in normal, ordinary cases of alterations, should become similar, actually similar to the agent. In this case, they should become actually perceptible. Therefore, we should expect to perceive our own sense organs every time we perceive. But Aristotle knows that this doesn't happen, or better, doesn't happen in normal situations, but it can happen in certain exceptional situations. So Aristotle needs a clarification of his claim that perception is an analysis test that considers both what's going on in normal cases, namely sense organs do not become perceptible to themselves, but also a view that allows him to explain what happens in exceptional situations, namely when sense organs are overwhelmed and undergo an actual assimilation that make them actually perceptible to themselves. So I said something about the finale of the Anima 2.5. This is the finale of the Anima 2.5 in Schill's translation with some slight modifications. Aristotle ends the chapter by saying, and I quote, "It is necessary to use being affected and being altered as though they were the appropriate names, since the difference between them has no name, though it has been determined with regard to them that they are different and how they are different." Then we have the last sentence, I quote, "What is capable of perceiving is in potentiality such as the object of perception is already in actuality, as was just said. Hence, it is affected while being alike what affects it, but when it has been affected, it has been made like it and is such as what affected it is." What I try to suggest with these quotes and these italics is that Aristotle has warned us that being affected has different meanings, that we are aware that it has different meanings, but we have to use, unfortunately, the same word as if it were appropriate because we have no other word. So I think this suggests that Aristotle is using affected in two different senses. So hence, in normal circumstances, the sense organ is affected in a spatial way while being alike what affects it. But when it has been affected in an ordinary assimilative way, it has been made like it and is such as what affected it is. Now, if there are questions about this passage, I believe that there will be questions about this passage or the other passages, of course, we can go back to them in the discussion. But at any rate, I'm fully aware that this last claim, the one about the exceptionality of perceptual assimilations, is quite unorthodox and certainly bound to be controversial. I say this because I'm aware that there is this cherished Aristotelian assumption that the outcome of the interaction between perceptual objects and the senses is a spatial assimilation of the sense to the perceived object. I deny this. I think that Aristotle doesn't believe that normal cases of perception cause a spatial assimilation of the senses to the perceived objects. Aristotle is talking about something physical, and physically speaking, in normal cases, there is no assimilation. An assimilation takes place only in exceptional situations. Defenders of the cherished Aristotelian assumption that there are always spatial assimilations in perception, I think they might wish to consider whether any other statement by Aristotle, besides this finale of the Anima 2.5, offers an ambiguous support to the view that normal instances of perception consist in an actual assimilation to the perceived object. The claims I know about the similarity of senses and perceptible objects always concern the potential similarity between them. Furthermore, I'm aware there are some of them that ambiguously suggest, I believe, that the potential similarity of what perceives to what is perceived is preserved while the interaction between perceptible objects and senses takes place. So this is the direction in which I would reply to defenders defendants of the cherished Aristotelian traditional assumption that every time we perceive there is a special alteration, a special assimilation of the senses to the perceived objects. But for now, this is what I had to say. I just mentioned another thing. I think that defendants of this cherished traditional assumption that there are always, in normal cases, special assimilations of the senses to the objects should also not conflate this view of them with other views Aristotle has about perception, namely that the actuality of the perceived objects and the actuality of the sense is one and the same, or the other famous view that in perception the senses receive the perceptible forms without the matter. These are different views. We should not conflate the view about spatial alterations with those views, or at least this is my opinion. But I said everything I had to say today, so I think we can end it here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roberto, for the lecture. We're opening now for questions. I would like to know if Lucas and Breno would like to start, and then later on I will add the questions from the audience if there are any.
Lucas, se quiser ir primeiro.
Your mic is mute.
Breno, you can start if you have a question. I have just a very specific question about a text.
Okay. Thank you, Roberto, for your presentation. I was already familiar with your reading of the chapter, and as you know, I think it's a very illuminating interpretation of this very difficult chapter. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with a clarification question, and it is about Aristotle's distinction between processes and activities, or changes and activities in Theta 6. And my question is whether this special non-assimilative alteration toward the derivative conditions that you take perception to be is a kinesis or energia in the classification of Theta 6. And I think that it sounds to me as if it is a kinesis, a sort of process. And we have, I mean, in contradiction to the tradition, you take the metabalon in 417A32 to refer to this kind of alteration that is that perception is like. Whereas the most common view is that it seems that this is Aristotle's view in Theta 6, for instance, that perception is an activity. So it's a kind of complete actuality, one that is that preserves the relevant capacity, and kinesis is a kind of actuality, incomplete actuality, one that is incompatible with the preservation of the relevant capacity and so on. So it's just in order to understand whether your reading commits Aristotle to the view that perception is a kind of kinesis in some way.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question, and I would like to say I have no answer to this question. But I would say I think the answer is not into 5, and one of the reasons is because I think we don't have a really unambiguous reply to this question into 5, is that it seems that Aristotle among other, because the chapter is full of details that I didn't discuss, of course. one of those is, it seems that Aristotle at a certain point before the knowledge section suspends the distinction between kinesis and energeia. And he says something like, yeah, after all, kinesis is an actuality of a certain kind, okay? And this is why I was talking about actualizations, okay? And I think this is a reason why we cannot find a very clear answer about this in 2.5, okay? He says that it's a certain type of alteration, and this would suggest it's a kinesis. Now, my personal reply, but it's not based on 2.5, is that Aristotle considers perception in two different ways, depending on what he's talking about. And I think I'm sympathetic with commentators who believe that Aristotle talks about perception as a physical event, let's say. And when he's talking about this, he uses is a certain alteration, is a certain type of kinesis. And I think this is, we could say it's the material aspect of perception. But I believe that when he's talking about perception as an energeia, he's talking about the reception of perceptible forms without the matter. And it's what we would describe as the mental aspect of perception. But again, this is not anything new, is not anything that all commentators accept. Many people think that talking about mental and material aspects is anachronistic, and we could say it's a formal aspect if we don't want to use mental aspect, but my reply would go in this direction, namely distinguishing formal or mental, in modern jargon, aspect of perception, which is an energeia, and a material aspect of perception, which is an aloisis, which is, I have another paper, you know, because I always present different versions of my work, but that one at least I ended and completed, and I was lucky to have it published. And I believe that we have texts that support the idea that Aristotle has a view about the physiology of perception, and this physiology is based on a sort of homeostatic counterbalancing. But anyway, I think that what Aristotle is doing here is resolving a problem that derives from his acceptance of the view that, yes, perception is a certain alteration, but is not an assimilative alteration. It cannot be an assimilative alteration, because if it were an assimilative alteration, we would have the problem of our sense organ becoming actually perceptible to themselves every time we perceive. So it's basically, if we could say that 2.5 is against literalism, that is a view about Aristotle's theory of perception. So I think basically Aristotle is saying literalism cannot work. If I go the literalist view, then I have this problem about self-perceptions of the sense organs. Perception is an alteration, but it's a very special alteration, and it's an alteration that I describe as an alteration towards potentially deprivative conditions. What this means, it means that there is a condition of stress that sometimes, when the sense organ is overwhelmed, really produce a normal alteration, namely an assimilation that makes the organ actually perceptible to itself. But it's talking, in my view, it's talking about the material side of perception. It has nothing to do with receiving forms without the matter, nothing to do with the identity of the actuality of the perceptible object in the actuality of the sense. It's different stuff, material aspect and formal or mental aspect. And I would say that energeia, perception is an energeia, mental aspect, perception is a certain kind of kinesis, material aspect. But 2.5.
Okay.
I mean, it's an implication of my reading of 2.5. I think that he's talking about something material, so a material, a causal interaction, a physical, in a literal sense, a physical causal interaction between sense organs and perceptible objects. But about kinesis and energeia, there is nothing really clear there, I believe.
So let me see if I understand. So someone could object to your reading by saying that, well, the more traditional interpretations of the text, insofar as they associate perception with the transition from K1 to K2, they somehow preserve Aristotle's view that perception is a kind of activity. So, and your reply is that if you take perception, so I mean, we can read Aristotle when he's talking about eistasis. He could either refer to the psychic activity or the material process the psychic activity supervenes on. And 2.5, Aristotle is talking about the material process on which the psychic activity supervenes, right?
Yeah, I don't know if we can say supervenience.
Okay,
this is another question, but anyway, let's say that we go the supervenience way, but yes, I would say something like that. About the preservative aspects, I didn't say that because I want to say as few controversial things as possible. But I think that this process is a preservation as well. It's not a preservation as an energeia is a preservation, but it is a preservation. And it is a preservation also in the case of learning, because the modified thing is just our ability to develop some cognitive skills, okay? And it's not destroyed.
Yeah. No.
It's not that we become unable to further acquire other skills, other limited or complete skills. So it's a preservation as well, and it's a preservation also in the case of the power to the perceptual power. It's preserved, and I think this is not visible in 2.5. It's visible in a passage in 2.10 when he's talking about that curious experience of tasting something when you have your tongue full of some bad tasting moisture, okay, some amargo, sour taste, okay, and there he uses this soteria. So it's a preservation, and what is in potentiality keeps being in potentiality, and so on. So I think he's preparing the field, let's say, for his view about the physiological aspect of perception that is a preservation. But it's I'm not committed to that in particular, but personally I believe it. But I know that it's a further controversial aspect, so I will limit the controversial aspects to the minimum possible, I think. So.
Thank you.
Lucas, your question?
Yes, I have a question more on the textual side, Roberto, is about that sentence in 417b56. The sentence is in Greek, theorunga gignitai tuikon ten epistemen. Translation is controversial, but I wonder how do you take it, because as far as I can remember, the standard reading of the sentence is the following, something like that. The someone who has knowledge but has in an unactivated state becomes theorum, becomes effectively or actually contemplating, something like that. So it will be the transition from, I think, what you have labeled K1 to K2, and this will be assumed as a model in contrast with each perception will be developed or defined, conceived by Aristotle. But there's an alternative way of taking this sentence, and I think it promotes your view, because it gets rid of this model to understand perception, which is the following way of taking the sentence. First of all, we don't have dignity doing the work of just the verb of linking subject and predicate in a nominal sentence. So the dignity is absolute. Just a second, I'm hearing my own voice in an echo. Something wrong here. Sorry. And so the dignity is absolute. The kind of dignity that should be translated as comes to be, comes to existence, or something like that. And the theorem, instead of being the predicate, is a participial sentence giving us the conditions under which that which turns out to be, namely the guy who has knowledge. So the idea is that this whoever has the knowledge turns out to be in that state of having knowledge by exercising episodes of knowledge by theorem. This is what is I think it's a possible way of taking the text. I don't see any grammatical difficulties to taking the text in this way. Some people believe that there are some grammatical ways, grammatical difficulties in taking in this way, but I don't think we have. And I wonder whether you would prefer this reading, because I think it's will promote your interpretation, at least by getting rid of this prominence given to the transition from key 1 to key 2 as a model to understand, not a model, but as a contrast to understand perception. So I think, sorry, it's probably complicated, but I hope it is understandable, and that's the question.
So it is understandable, Lucas, thank you. And I remember we discussed this in a previous incarnation of my views about 2.5, and I reflected about it, and I think you're right. And I also saw that there are some older translations, like Hicks translated the way you were suggesting it. And the reason why most people translate it the other way is exactly because they want it to be an allusion to second transitions, and they wanted to say, Aristotle to say, second transition, this thing is either not an alteration or a special kind of alteration, okay? Now, in the previous version, since I had no problems with this, because I could always say, no, Aristotle is talking about the actuality of knowing itself, like the second interpretation is claiming, and he's saying that the actualization of knowledge, therefore knowing, can be either transformational or non-transformational, no problem. But then I thought about it, and actually it's perfect, as you were suggesting, it's perfect for my reading. Why? Because I have, in the first part of the knowledge section, as I said, I have this view that Aristotle is talking about the difference between students and, let's say accomplished knowers with regard to their access to knowing something. Like, and the example is very simple, knowing an alpha, okay? So the professor knows an alpha because has the professor skill set, and the student knows an alpha because with the help of the professor, he or she has developed this limited cognitive skills of recognizing an alpha, okay? But then I realized what I'm missing is exactly a sentence by Aristotle drawing attention to his famous view, nobody is denying this, that the way in which we acquired skills, this can be moral skills, but can be cognitive skills as well, is by doing stuff, namely by knowing that this sign is an alpha, a beta, or whatever other letter, okay? So I was in the position of I have to say this to the reader and say, look, Aristotle is implicitly thinking about his famous and widely accepted, uncontroversially accepted view that it is by knowing that we acquire some knowledge skills. But I don't need to say that, because Aristotle is Aristotle himself is referring to that doctrine exactly in this passage, in this phrase you were talking about. Aristotle is saying what possesses knowledge comes about by contemplating, by knowing, okay? And this is the reason why some activation of knowledge must be transformative. Not all activation of knowledge are not alterations, okay? Not all activations of knowledge are second transitions in which we simply switch on some previously acquired knowledge. Some activations, some transitions to knowing must be transformative. Why? Because it is by contemplating that the possessor of knowledge comes about, as you were suggesting. So in this talk, I used that translation. So in that passage, my translation, which is different from Schild's translation, is for what possesses knowledge comes about by contemplating, which is either not being altered, okay, when the activation is non-transformative. Aristotle himself saying this, since the progression is into itself and into actuality, or a different kind of alteration. Why? Because the possessor of knowledge comes about by contemplating. So some activations, some transitions to knowing must be transformative. There's no way to, we can say that I'm claiming something that is not there, but we cannot deny that this is Aristotle's position. For Aristotle, it's implicit in Aristotle's position that some activation of knowing, namely the activation of knowing this beta when I don't know what a beta is, are transformative, because it is in this way that, according to Aristotle, I come to know what a beta is. Okay, so okay, I accept that some people don't buy this as an interpretation of 2.5, but I think it's quite uncontroversial that this is as an implication of Aristotle's views about how we learn. So yes, but to give a simple reply, I fully agree with you now after some further reflection on your suggestion, and I'm totally, I totally buy this translation of that phrase that you were suggesting. I think it's also my translation of that.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that Hicks has translated in that way. I didn't know that. I have read Hicks a long time ago, and I couldn't remember that. But I'm glad that to hear that.
I didn't remember it as well, but after our conversation, I was collecting all the translations in Portuguese, French, with the help of Google Translator of German, and English, Italian, and it's, of course, it's debated, it's ambiguous, the sentence, but there are some people who translate it that way, and I think it is the correct way to translate the sentence.
So, Roberto, we have 3 questions here on the chat. I will post them to you in the order they were made. The first is by Samana Costa, and she says that in the Anima, Aristotle talks about sensation, and you translated for perception. And she wonders whether you take those terms to be the same, I think.
I take personally, but I know it's debated. Some people think that sensation and perception should refer to different things. Maybe I don't have a position about that philosophical problem, but when I translate aesthesis, for me, sensation and perception is the same thing. So for me, Aristotle is talking about aesthesis, which we may translate as perception or sensation, depending on our views about what is perception and sensation. But Aristotle is talking about aesthesis, and when I say perception, I mean aesthesis. So, reply.
Okay, so the next question is by Alice Darmijan, and she asks you, you mentioned in chapter 5 that chapter 5 goes against literalism. Do you also believe that it goes against spiritualist reading?
I think it offers no support for a spiritual reading. So this goes obviously against Barnett's reading, because Barnett was saying that in his reading of the chapter that this chapter paves the way for the further development of this notion of spatial alteration, which is the notion that grounds the spiritualist reading of Aristotle's theory of perception. So I think that in 2.5 offers no support for the spiritualist reading, but personally I'm committed to a spiritualist reading of the Anima 2.12. Okay, actually I have a reading that is probably more spiritualist than the spiritualist reading of the Anima 2.12, but this is in another paper and it's a separate topic. I think that the notion of receiving perceptible forms without the matter is one thing. The notion of perception is an aloiosis tris is a totally different thing. So 2.5 doesn't offer any support to the spiritualist reading of Aristotle's theory of perception, in my view. So my reading of 2.5 is completely different from Barnett's reading. It's completely different from anyone's reading, as far as I know. And probably nobody is going to accept it. But my challenge is to show that it's a possible and reasonable reading, among others, of the chapter.
Okay, we have one more question on the chat before we turn back to Lucas and Breno, who have more questions. This one is by Paulo Tadeu Ferreira, our friend from Unifesp. It's a big question. As usual, Paulo is very close in the Greek. So he asks this. He says, I may have missed part of your explanation due to unstable internet connection, but I would like to stress that whereas in lines 417, 8, 22, 23 have epistemon T, another in a way, lines 417, 8, 24, 25 have, there is a way in which we already call one a knower. And amphotera hoi pratoi at line 47, 830 may naturally be read in the following way. And here, this is his interpretation. This is the next one, yes. Hoi pratoi anaphorically picks up on those who have already who are already knowers, not knowers in a way. And amphotera categorically anticipates the distinction at lines 417, 831, B2. As in the following two paraphrases, either both following kinds of the preceding first, the ones we already call knowers, are knowers potentially, or both following kinds of the preceding first knowers, yet the ones we already call knowers are in potentiality. And he adds, I take epistemonis as either predicative or attributive, or more or less indifferently. I hope I have given you a good sense of his question.
So I think that the first two are K0 and K1. Okay, so as far as the first two knowers in a certain sense, I have no difference to register from the standard view. But what goes on after that is the difference. Okay, so the difference is amphoteroi, yes, as the standard view, I think is those two who are in potentiality knowers, namely K0 and K1. Okay, so the ignorant subject and the professor, let's say. Okay, but the standard view says that they are in potentiality. Why? Because this is the standard view. K0 is in potentiality a professor, namely K0 is in potentiality K1, and K1 is in potentiality K2. Okay, this is the standard view. I think that it's correct to say that both are in potentiality a knower, but they both are in potentiality a knower in K2. No, not in K2 sense, because K2 in the standard view is only the activation of K1. Okay, both are in potentiality knowing knowers. Okay, which is the third sense of knower that Aristotle has just differentiated. So amphoteroi, both K0 and K1 are in potentiality knowing knowers, which is the main meaning of knower, okay, because it's someone who is engaging in actual knowing, okay. But this, what this means is that Aristotle is not talking about first transitions by which K0 becomes K1 against second transitions by which K1 becomes K2, but Aristotle is talking about the way in which an ignorant subject engages in some knowing against the way in which a professor, K1, engaged in some knowing. The example is very appropriate for this because it's talking about knowing this alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet and the first number in ancient times. So it would be like saying that someone who doesn't know any maths or any grammar and an alphabet can engage in, with the help of a professor, knowing this alpha or this one, okay, this number one on a table, okay, and the way in which this subject can engage in knowing this alpha, this beta, or whatever else is different from the way in which the professor can engage in knowing this alpha, and this is the difference Aristotle has in mind. Then, as I said, he says, yeah, but the possessor of knowledge comes about by knowing, therefore, some activations of knowledge, some access to knowing something like this alpha is transformative. This is what's going on in the knowledge section, in my view. But the point is, if you don't buy the addition implicit or even written by Ross in the Greek text of that sentence that makes it clear that amphoteroi is referring to K0 and K1 and that K0 is in potentiality K1, okay? If you don't accept that this is implicit in the Greek text, it must be, or even there was a line in the manuscript that has dropped in some way, therefore I am authorized to write in Greek that line that must be there, as Ross has told. If you don't buy this heavy intervention in the text, either implicitly or explicitly in the text, then the text doesn't make any sense if you read it as a text that distinguishes the way in which K2 becomes K1 and the way in which K1 becomes K2. I believe. Because it's saying that K0 is in potentiality a knower after K0 has been altered by learning. Really? K0 must be taught something before it can be taught something? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. That's the reason why Ross added the line. It doesn't make sense. And the line that is in the text of the OCT, the Oxford Classical Text, is in any case in all translations. So all translations have this line, either as intervention by the translator to make sense of the text, or as an intervention of the philologist producing the edition of the Greek. So it's in all translations. Why? Because if you translate it without this addition, the text doesn't make any sense. Other way, you have to ignore that Aristotle is saying having been altered, and you say by an alteration. Okay, if you say this, it makes sense. But this is not what the Greek is saying. The Greek is saying having been altered by learning, not by a learning-related alteration.
I guess now Breno has a question. Breno?
Yes. It's more like a curiosity about it. I mean, we have just discussed an aspect in which the transmitted text favors your view, I think. And the most readings depends on Ross' emendation to make sense of the text. But I'm curious about the transmitted text in line 32. And we have, because we have, the codices have aesthetism, right? And not then arithmetic n. I'm not fully satisfied with, I think, Burnett's justification for not reading aesthesis here, especially because I think that the more traditional interpretations can somehow accommodate or include the text as transmitted, although the text is strange anyway. I admit that, but at least they can preserve the text as transmitted in the sense that they are taking aesthesis to be compared by Aristotle to the transition from K1 to K2 or just K2, right? And whereas in your view, it seems that it sounds like fatal to your reading if this is the text. I know that the text is strange and there are, I mean, many arguments that can be set up to explain. It could be just a correction by a confused copyist, but I'm curious about what would be your explanation for.
So the aesthetic there, it's controversial as well, and I think it's wrong. And there is a text that is transmitted, if I'm not wrong, by a commentary by Alexander that says it is arithmetic n. So the idea would be that o de ek tu eken ten arithmetic n et grammatic n. Now, the one from having either letters, grammatic n, which is knowing the alphabet, basically, knowing how to read and write, or knowing numbers, which I think has the support of Alexander, and it makes perfect sense because alpha can be alpha, the letter, or can be a number in ancient times. So I think it makes perfect sense. But in any case, that bit is referring to someone who is K1, so OD, então K1, ek tu eken ten arithmetiken et grammatiken, so from having the knowledge, so the first actuality of knowledge, but not an again, με ενεργέιν δε, έχει το ενεργέιν, άλλων τρόπων. That bit of the text, I have no problem with the traditional interpretation. There, we are talking about K1, who is simply switching on some knowledge already achieved. Okay. The part where I have problems is with the other one, namely Allah, omen, diamatesios, aloiotes, kai polakis, ex enantias, metabalon, exeos. Therefore, the first one, which is K0, and again, identification of the subject, no problem. I'm on the same side as the traditional interpretation. We are talking about the first guy, namely K0, someone who is a knower just because he's a member of the human species, and the humans are among the things who have knowledge. Okay, so K0, omen, diamatesios, alloiotes, kai polakis, ex enantias, metabalon, exeos. Now, if what Aristotle is saying is that K0 is potentially K1, and this is the standard view, okay, he's saying K0 is potentially K1, diamatesios alloiotes, kai polakis ex enantias metabalon exeos. So K0 is potentially K1, having been altered by learning, and metabalon is an aorist, can be past, can be present with no, but let's say, and shifting many times, polakis, from a contrary state. Okay. About metabalon, I don't have commitment to what really it means. In my view, it means that metabalon is referring to previous exercise teacher assisted activations that have been repeated. Why? Because it's not all the students gain this transformation in their skill set by just by one activation. Okay, like you remember, I was using the Japanese character in the first version. Okay, I was using a Japanese character which corresponds to the to our A. Okay, I don't remember that. I mean, I wrote it several times, but I don't remember that. Okay, so I think that if I have to recognize it in a group of other Japanese symbols, I don't recognize it. I don't. Okay. So I think Aristotle is referring to this. This skill of recognizing the alpha has been achieved after many, in normal cases, after repeated teaching assisted activations of this is an alpha, this is an alpha, this is a beta, this is theta in capital letter. Okay. Recognize all the letters of the Greek alphabet is not something that all people can do just after one activation of this is an alpha. Okay, and I believe Aristotle is referring to this. So having shifted several times from the contrary state, namely having shifted from absolute ignorance or ignorance of what an alpha is to knowing this alpha. Yes, I know this is the alpha. This is the alpha. After 5 minutes, you don't know it. So there is that activation of this is an alpha didn't produce that
I was more worried about eistasing in line 32. If we had, yeah.
U is not there. It's not there. It's wrong to read eistasis there, and my the authority I can use is the authority of a text that is preserved in Alexander of Aphrodisias' commentary, which precedes even the older versions, the older manuscripts we have. So it's a choice that different curators, editors of the Greek text have made, and some of them have printed arithmetic n, following the authority of Alexander commentary, and others have decided to go with the manuscripts and print eistesin. I think that the correct view is arithmetic n.
I thought that just the Mistus had the eistesin, but okay.
But yeah, I will check it again, but my decision was made based on Alexander's of Aphrodisias commentary. But I will recheck it, because if it's eistesin, yes, it's kind of more problematic. But it's problematic, I think, even in the standard view, why Aristotle is referring to eistesis there.
But it's not as problematic for them as it is for you, I think. Although it's a strange.
Yeah, for them it's not problematic in the sense that they want eistesis to be like a second transition.
Yeah.
But the problem is, okay, let's suppose that eistesis is there, but then this is something that I didn't develop, okay? But Aristotle says in the standard view that a second transition is either not an alteration or a certain kind of alteration. Then he says, yes, it's not an alteration because it's like a builder, because it's like someone who is not being helped by a teacher. In those cases, we know that it's not an alteration. So where is the supposed reason by which Aristotle would consider a second transition, namely the transition from K1 to K2, a special kind of alteration? There is no reason there. And we have reasons why Aristotle does not consider this second transition an alteration at all. Obviously, yes, if you are Miles Barnett or you are following what Miles Barnett said, you will say, yeah, but it's obvious that Aristotle is willing to say that despite arguments in the for the contrary view, we could describe a second transition as a sort of alteration, even though it doesn't offer any argument, even though the only reason why this is supposed to be a certain special alteration has been criticized by all commentators who are not buying this interpretation. So there is, apparently there is no uncontroversial reason why we should think that the transition from K1 to K2 is a certain kind of alterations, but you can read it that way. I'm not saying that it's impossible to read it that way, but I'm pointing that you have to know that there is no unambiguous argument for that claim, that there are two arguments, explicit arguments in the text to show that a second transition, namely what I called a non-transformative activation of knowledge, is not an alteration at all. Then if you want to ignore that, okay, I hope that at least you concede that I could read the passage in another way.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm, as I have said before, I think in general I'm convinced about, especially about how the chapter works as a whole, and about the aporia that of the beginning of the chapter that becomes irrelevant in most interpretations, I think. I was just more concerned about this other aspect of the transmitted text, which is the presence of eistesis in arithmetic n. And I'm not fully aware of the discussion about the transmission of the text, but it looks as if you just look at the critical apparatus, it seems that the best, from a strictly philological point of view, it would be good to accommodate eistesis in the text, if possible. And the traditional interpretations are in better conditions to accommodate that word there. But if this is not if we have compelling reasons to think that this is not the text, then I'm completely on board.
Yeah, I will think about if I can be creative enough to accommodate eistesis, but right now I have no way to accommodate eistesis, and my answer would be, look, It's controversial if it's isocene or arithmetic n. Arithmetic n is, there is some philologically grounded reason, namely it was in the text that Alexander of Aphrodisias was using. This could suggest that it was later modified by someone who has interpreted it, the chapter and the passage in the standard way. Okay, so this could explain why it has been modified in a later age. And other thing, alpha, the example. The example is perfect for grammatic n and arithmetic n. We're talking about letters and numbers. Alpha was a letter and a number. So today this would be my reply, but I will try to see if I can accommodate also this version of the text.
Okay, I think Lucas has a question now, right, Lucas?
Yes, well, it's a more general question, Roberto, about the meaning of soteria in the text and the meaning of soteria in this debate. So soteria appears in 417b3 and probably later too. Well, I'm not fully aware of the literature, so, and this is, I don't have a horse in this race, as we used to say. So I'm not aware of the discussions, the details of the discussions, but I wonder if it would be useful to discuss what soteria exactly means in this context, because we might use soteria, and I think Aristotle has used soteria in several different ways. For instance, one preferred way of using the word and the correlated words we have in English or Portuguese or Italian, like preservation, conservation, etc., etc., is to think of soteria as just a way of avoiding destruction. So there's something there and it's going to perish if you don't do anything. So you have to have a plan in order to keep it safe from destruction. So, for instance, when we say about preservation of buildings, and even the preserves, the jam, the strawberry jam is kind of this idea of preserve is pretty much like this. But there is another way of taking soteria, which we find in Aristotle's texts in general, and it's completely congenial with other ways we use those words like conservation, preservation, keeping, and the correlated words in Portuguese and Italian, which is more like maintenance. So in this case, maintenance is it could be a set of very specific procedures by which you keep something working and properly working. So this is different from preserving your smoked fish, or preserve your building, or just to preserve something which is fated to disappear or to perish. Like, for instance, I'm thinking about a lot of occurrence of soteria in biological works, in which it means to keep the system of the organism or a part of the organism properly working. And in using the word like this, I think we are not only open, but we are implying that soteria involves a lot of specific processes that might be taken as alterations. It's just a very, very stupid example, but so suppose you are in charge of preserving a historical building or something like that. Not a historical building, but just your house. You're in charge of preserving and keeping your house. So you have to do a lot of alterations in your house, like to replace some woods in the windows, or to replace the painting in the walls, etc., etc. Sometimes you have to destroy things like an entire wall, and to fix many things. All this counts as alteration, but as this counts as soteria. It's pretty similar to what happens with house building, Newcomer Kinetics 10. At least is analog. So you have house building as a whole process, but the process is made of partial processes. Well, I'm not going to analyze now the house building in Newcomer Kinetics, but I think it's there is enough analogy in these two cases. So to preserve something is to make some, let's just say, proper modifications in the object you are meant to preserve, and those alterations and modifications are going to, at large or in the whole context, to work as preserving or keeping on or conservating process. So since the Anima 2.5 and other texts as well are taking soteria and aloiosis as, let's just say, two poles of a contrast, two important poles of a contrast, I wonder whether it would be important to be very clear about what soteria means, because what aloiosis and Pascal might mean in the contrast, in the context, in this context of the Anima 2.5, probably should be controlled by what soteria is encoding in this situation. So what I mean is this: so it might be that what Aristotle is discussing under those labels, Pascal, aloiosis, and soteria, is very, very specific, and it has a lot of assumptions and presuppositions which we are supposed to disentangle. And I know that some of this discussion has been done in the past, but I'm not fully aware of it. But I'm not thinking of anything like this atomistic things about conservative or preservative alterations. There's not anything like that. It's just thinking about what exactly might be meant in this pair of concepts here. It's just a general question.
Well, I must admit that I didn't pay much attention about soteria, and I think I didn't do it because I assumed that, I mean, I'm okay with the meaning that most commentators give to soteria there, and to the opposition between soteria and aloiosis. Namely, the idea would be aloiosis in that case, when it's contrasted with soteria, would be the ordinary aloiosis, which not all commentators, but most commentators think is characterized by the destruction of one contrary by the other one. So it would be, the classic example would be, it's hot, there is an alteration by a cold object, and the heat, the being hot of the patient, is destroyed under the action of the agent, and this destruction is an alteration, an ordinary alteration. So as opposed to these special alterations, or these non-alterations, are preservations. Why? Because there is no opposition between contraries, and there is no destruction by the contrary that belongs to the agent. So soteria would be, yes, would be the lack of destruction, basically. This would be the meaning. But yeah, probably I should pay more attention to this term and study the other ones, the other occurrences. And in that case, I would say probably something like, it depends if we are talking about the consequences of an alteration for the subject, who is the patient, okay? Then some alterations or some series of alterations can still be soteria, because, for example, one example would be when we acquire limited skills, and then all these alterations are a preservation of when we are building something. Yeah, we can say that, I don't know, painting a wall in a different color is part of the project of this building that we are building, and then it's an alteration, therefore could be said to be a destruction. But since we are talking about this process as part of the whole process of construction of that particular, realization of that particular project, it's soteria. Yes, it's more complicated if we are talking about this sort of distinction, but I have to consider if I can be happy just by repeating what most commentators are saying, namely distinguishing soteria as the mark that distinguishes all these spatial activations Aristotle is talking about, and to keep soteria as the term that distinguishes these spatial alterations from ordinary alterations that are destructive. So today I think that I'm happy with that. So I'm happy without any further study about soteria. But if there are some dangerous implications there that can be against my reading, I have to think about it. But if you think that there's something there, like that accepting this standard reading has some implications that are against my interpretation, let me know, and I will try to avoid that.
Can I add something on? I think I'm not sure that your interpretation will be in danger, but I'm worried about this general problem, because if soteria can be taken in one of the ways I was suggesting, so there is absolutely nothing paradoxical in saying that something which counts as a soteria is in a way an aloiosis tis, because it's just the example I have just made about the keeping the house. So you replace something, you paint it with a new color, etc., etc. These are alterations, but this is soteria of the house, and then that's the implications I'm seeing. And I guess my impression is that most commentators, at least the commentators I have read about this text, the Anima 2.4, take soteria just as lack of destruction. And I wonder whether this is kind of one of the sources of their missing the point, or at least not reaching a good, strong and robust interpretation. Because when, for instance, in the Anima, the Somno, when Aristotle says that the sleep is for the sake of soteria, Henica soterias, he doesn't mean just well, in order to avoid dying. He means more than that. So we sleep every day, and it's a cycle. Every day we have to sleep, and all the animals normally do that, not only to avoid destruction or perishing, but in order to keep their functioning, and somehow Yeah, but I'm going too far on this, but I think the general idea is clear. So if there is nothing paradoxical in saying that a soteria is an alloiosistis, I think this is important for your whole picture.
I agree with what you're saying. If we are talking about we are talking in general, okay. So I don't think it's absurd to say that something that is a soteria is an alloiosis in general. But here Aristotle is considering these knowledge activations, okay? And it is in relation to this knowledge activation that is talking about the fact that being affected is not simple, but one is like a distraction, another one is like soteria. And he says that thing because the possessor of knowledge comes about by knowing, and then he says, and this is either not an alteration or a different kind of alteration. Okay, so he's talking about how we should use these labels with regard to knowledge activations. And I think in this context, it seems that when it talks about the knowledge activation of someone who already achieved full knowledge, okay, someone who has achieved K1, the first actuality of knowledge, he always says that it's not an alteration. It says, so it is correct not to talk about someone who is, he says, who is knowing and understanding, okay, is not an alteration in the same way as someone who is building is not altered, okay? So in this context, even though in general it's not absurd, in this context, it seems to me that he's repeating, he's insisting that if we are talking about the knowledge activation of someone who has reached and has achieved the first actuality of knowledge, so an expert or a scientist, there is no alteration, okay? And the reason why there is no alteration is that K1 is activated, and then after the activation, what we have is K1 again. There is no transformation. There is no further development. Okay, there is no transformation. Then in this context, I think if he's using soteria as in this sense, there is no transformation. Okay, I think he's saying that the ordinary alteration is a distraction, and all the activation of knowledge are soteria, and among these preservations, some are not alterations at all, and others are spatial alterations. Spatial alteration because they are not distractions. So in this context, I would say that soteria in this context work in that way, but I'm not committed to the idea that in general it's absurd to say that an alloiosis is a preservation. So it's just that type of ordinary alteration that includes a distraction is not soteria in this context, at least. But probably I should be more careful about that, or clarify the thing, clarify it, have a better clarification. Yeah, write something about that.
We have two more questions from the audience. The first one is from Bruno Thiago, a student of ours. He asks whether you think there's any criteria to define cases where perception may provoke some modification in the patient.
Okay, I think yes, there is a criterion, and this would be if we are talking about modification in the sense that they produce an ordinary alteration. The criterion is the intensity of the stimulation. So when you undergo a certain overwhelming stimulation, okay, the organ can't, let's say, can't counterbalance this stimulation, and it ends up being actually altered. So the idea would be, for example, if you hear some very intense sound, like you go to some music event and you are really close to some speaker, okay, then you have some damage in your hearing because the stimulus was very intense. If you look at some very intense light, then you have some after image, and this after image is nothing but persistent affection in your eye. To be more precise, in the non-sensitive part of your eye, there is some sort of after image, and what happens is that your eye, the sensitive part of your eye is seeing the non-sensitive part of the eye that has this persistent image, okay? So the criterion would be the intensity of the stimulation. So when the stimulation is overwhelming, you have an actual modification in your eye, and this modification is detrimental. It's not a positive development. It's permanent or temporary damage on your ability to perceive. So the criterion would be that one.
Okay, so we have one more question and an observation from Paulo. Alice, thank you for the answer to her question, and she also wants to ask you, what do you think about Charles' argument against the literalist-spiritualist debate? She guesses your reading against his strong economic reading too.
So my position in general about the physiological aspects of Aristotle's theory of perception is very generally is what we could label as structuralist interpretation, which is neither literalist nor spiritualist. And it's probably, at least in the US, I think it's the most popular interpretation. And this interpretation is, yes, Aristotle admits that there are some physiological aspects, there are some changes going on in the sense organs, but these changes are not a literal becoming like the perceptible objects. So there are changes, therefore spiritualist is wrong, and there are non-literal changes, therefore literalism is wrong. So there are changes that are some sort of codification of the stimulus. So it's generally speaking, this is I'm sympathetic with this type of interpretation. But people who propose this interpretation normally think that Aristotle says this when he says that perception is a reception of forms without the matter. I think that this is not what happens. I don't think that this is the way we should read this aspect of Aristotle's theory of perception. So I think that there is this sort of physiology, but Aristotle is not referring to this sort of physiology when he says that perception is a reception of forms without the matter. So I have a very unorthodox reading, but this one I managed to publish it, So if you are interested, I can say where is this paper, and you can read it, and it's a good interpretation, a very bad interpretation. So I position on this about Aristotle section, and it's not something that has anything to do with the office. It's something different.
The last part of what you said, we couldn't quite understand, I think, because of your connection. Yeah.
Okay. It's hearing me?
No. Actually, yeah, you're breaking up for us.
Can you hear me?
Very poorly, very poorly. Maybe you could try to get out and reconnect. Yeah, I think we're losing Roberto here.
You hearing me now? Not. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Well, I hope he can get back on quickly. We have here a remark that Paulo has made in the chat. And since it's about Breno, I think we can... Oh, he's back. Let's see if he's connected better now. He's completely frozen for us. Let me just let him know. And before we put Paulo's observation on screen, because it's for Breno, actually, about something Breno said. He says, about Breno's remark on ecstasy, Alexander does not quote the Anima 2.5, either his own De Anima Mantiso Questiones. It is Themistius' paraphrase that gives arithmetic in, but there is no way to know whether that is the lesson he finds in manuscript or a correction he makes. All other sources, he adds, give ecstasy.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So that was precisely the presupposition of my question, that only Themistius had ecstasy as a paraphrasis, and this is what is annotated in Ross edition, right?
Just a second, Daniel. Roberto is in backstage. I think you have to put him in.
I can, but here's my point. His image is frozen in the backstage, contrary to all our images, which are working perfectly. So what I'm thinking is he is still having internet problems. That's what I'm trying to tell him on a private chat. So Breno, you can carry on, I think, with Paulo's observation.
No, I don't have any comments. I don't know. I also thought that that only Themistius' paraphrases had maybe Roberto, if he's definitely back, he'll probably be able to clarify that.
Okay, I think we have him back now. I'll mute myself and unmute him. Let's see. Roberto?
Same. Can you hear me now? Okay. So the question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, his image is not looking good. I think he's having problems. Now it's a little better, but yeah, it's frozen a lot. It's freezing a lot. We're approaching our time too, so I would like him to give some last considerations, but that's about it. I don't know. Let's see. Let's see if it gets. Yeah, I think we lost Roberto. You probably have to initialize his PC or reset his internet connection or something. I don't know. Let me ask him if he would like us to wait for him. So if he can add something, a closing statement or something. That's weird. He says his internet is working perfectly. There, I mean, he can hear us fine. For some reason, we're not hearing him.
No, try again. Yes.
Try again. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So now it's working. For me, it was working all the time, but I don't know what's going on. But anyway, technology. So what was the last question? Okay, because I'm lost now.
Actually, it was just an observation from Paulo. I'll put it on the screen again. He is about Brenner's remark on eistasis, and he's saying that Alexander does not quote the Anima too in his works. It is Thesmistius who does it, and that there is no way to know whether that is the lesson he finds in his manuscripts or if it is a correction he makes. And he adds that all other sources give eistasis.
Mm-hmm. What is the line? The arithmetic n is that one that we are talking about.
I'm not hearing Roberto.
Needs to that. Okay. Yeah, I will look at that. I don't know in what apples there was a solution for arithmetic. Roster is in the Oxford Thesis again, isn't it? Have a look at the size. I need to find out something for that. Clause as the transition from possession of knowledge, blah blah blah. The present particular or some others needed. There is no indication and must suppose he the tourist Alexander Peterson which was okay. Yes, for Ross, this to can yes, in this case, I will go and use the process items as were not the text. Are you still hearing me?
Unfortunately not, Roberto, very poorly. Yeah, something happened now close to the end of the questioning where, we unfortunately could not hear your comments about Paulo's question. But anyway, I think we're approaching our time here. It's already 2 hours and close to 15 minutes of streaming. So unless, Roberto, you want to try again to log off and restart your internet and come back to make some final considerations, I think we could wrap it up for today. What do you think?
The voice on or everything?
Okay, everybody, I'm going to wrap it up then. Unfortunately, we had some technical problems in the end. You couldn't really hear Roberto's consideration about Paulo's questioning, but I hope you have all enjoyed the discussion we had here today and the rest of Roberto's presentation, which was sure very enlightening about a very difficult piece of Aristotelian text. So thank you all for coming, and I would like to thank again Roberto, Breno, and Lucas for being here today on this first session of our symposium, despite technical problems. We'll come back in March with Breno's presentation. You can find the title and the date on the site for the symposium. I would please ask you to refer to it. And if you still have any doubts after you saw the site, please write to the email and I will get in touch with you as soon as possible. Thank you very much and see you all in March.